Well, hello and welcome to a session that the three of us are really excited to provide. It's on defining inclusionary practices in Catholic schools, and let's get started by introducing ourselves. Jennifer, why don't you start off by introducing yourself, if you would?
Hello, I'm Jennifer Amalivia. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Maryland in the special education department.
And Greg?
Yeah, hi, Greg Cheatham. I'm at the University of Kansas, a faculty member in the special education department.
And my name is Sean Smith. I'm a faculty member with Greg, a colleague here at the University of Kansas in the Department of Special Education, but I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Notre Dame. And with that, the three of us, when actually Jennifer was just finishing up her dissertation and getting her doctorate here at the University of Kansas, it seems just like days ago, Jennifer, and yet it was well over a year. But we had an opportunity to participate in this special issue. And this special issue, if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, this is an overview, and actually we're going to extend the article that the three of us wrote, because you can read the article. We want to kind of extend it in this session. And with that in mind, we really focused in on this session in respect to inclusion. And inclusion to us is really, really important. And Jen and Greg are going to pop in here in just a second, but for me, as a parent of a child with a disability, inclusion is critical not only for his educational experience, but his overall life experience. And Jen and Greg, when we were thinking about inclusion, I know a lot of things were going through our heads.
Yeah, especially my focus area is early childhood special education. So inclusion really means for me as an early childhood educator, access to services. So how can we provide parents with the resources that they need, especially given if we think about COVID, what's going on and how parents are having access currently to the services for their children with disabilities.
And Greg is actually going to get us started by actually defining inclusion. So let's get started here, folks. And what this session is going to focus in on is really this idea of inclusion in Catholic education in Catholic schools, something we all aspire to, and yet some of the challenges. And hopefully at the end of the session, we can reinforce what's going on, reinforce some elements and ideas, and leave us with some practicalities for tomorrow. So Greg, go ahead and get us started with this idea of inclusion.
Wonderful. So what we see here is we put in the definition or some things to think about with inclusion. And although this definition or these ideas focus on early childhood, the idea is this cuts across from early childhood up through grade 12. And something to think about. So I'm going to adapt this a little bit as it's a quote, but I'll just say, inclusion embodies the values, the policies, and the practices that support the right of every student and his or her family, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, regardless of ability or disability, right? To participate in a broad range of activities and contexts as full members of families, communities, and society. So one of the things we'll emphasize here in a few minutes is this idea of family and community as a part of inclusion. It isn't just about the school. There's a lot more here, especially as Jennifer mentioned, in the era of COVID that we're in right now. The defining features of inclusion that can be used to identify high quality educational programs and services focus on three things: access, that is getting those children or those students into the classroom; participation, ensuring that those children are provided with means to meaningfully participate in the activities, the routines, the classroom. And the final one is supports, and that's on the educator. And that is, what are the supports that we can provide to ensure that children have the ability to participate and that they have meaningful access to the environment that's inclusive.
Now, there's some research on this, Greg, in terms of what we know about inclusion.
Yeah, so there's been quite a bit of research done across the past 20 years or so. And one of the things that we know is that there are benefits to the students, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And this is good news, because I think that's one of the biggest concerns for educators and families at times is, well, if I make my classroom more inclusive, what's that going to do to the students who are not, who don't have disabilities? And what we find is that social development, academics, developmental gains, disability severity, or that is disability symptoms, right? As well as views about children and students with disabilities all improve in inclusive environments. And this is a big key. So it's something that I use as a talking point when thinking about inclusion, both for families as well as for educators. So we know that children and students with disabilities can make progress towards individualized goals within the inclusive classroom. That is, the old model would be, hey, they need to be pulled out, they need to be in a different environment, they don't need to be here because it's actually best for them to be somewhere else. It's not what research is saying. And that includes children with more significant disabilities, provided inclusionary environments that include, again, those three things: access, participation, and support. When those are provided, we see that children indeed do make gains on their goals. Specialized instruction, for example, that instruction that's embedded within the natural routines of the general education classroom, are key, and can be implemented in inclusive environments, not just the pull-out setting. And finally, families generally have positive views about inclusion, and collaboration, as we'll talk about, is essential for inclusion to be successful.
That's great. That's great. Now, this visual we know is difficult to see. So, FYI, it's in the article. So when you get a chance to take a look at that article, and if you need that reinforcement, this journal is free to access. You download. But Jennifer wants to kind of reinforce this visual that it really represents, I think, the essence of what we're trying to say.
Yeah, so the visual that's in the article, it illustrates 4 quadrants. It illustrates the church, the Holy Family, the parish community, and Catholic schools. So all 4 of those components, when we're talking about inclusion, especially for children with disabilities and their families in Catholic schools, are very important, not only as an educational standpoint, but as a Catholic principle of including all families in our practices. So one of the main things, especially with Catholic schools and parishes, it's our responsibility to ensure that we are making an environment that is welcoming for all people to come together as a family to worship God, not only God, but also to have come together to talk about the sacraments, a place that is welcoming and inviting, where all people feel invited.
Well, Jen, so one of the unique aspects of Catholic education that we all live is the fact that we're a community. I mean, the public school, yeah, maybe they're a neighborhood community, but maybe some neighborhoods aren't connected. But the parish, right from the get-go, we are a family, and so the Catholic school fits within that family, right?
Yes, I agree with that. It does, because we are taught to have certain values and beliefs, and we all share those. And being part of a community, especially a parish community, it reinforces those beliefs, and it makes you feel it's inviting for people. But one of the things we also have to extend that when we are thinking about serving families with children with disabilities. If that's one of our parish goals and our goals as a Catholic community, we also need to remember to look at how we can also extend that to people who have children with disabilities, how we can make them feel included, make them feel invited, and make them part of that parish community that we do so regularly with other children that are typically developing.
So for us, this visual kind of reinforces, 2 primary components. One, and I think the pandemic, and we're going to talk about this here in just a moment, has heightened, and that is the power of what we already have here in the Catholic community, and that is that connection between the home and school and home, and vice versa. We know during the pandemic we've leaned on our parents in a way that we haven't leaned in the past. Now, at times, some of us out there have been fully remote. Others of us have been fully face-to-face. And yet fully face-to-face, we've still worn our masks and we've had to be socially distanced. And so parents have had to be flexible. Parents have had to be more open for the communication that we're sharing. And communication has changed day to day. And so that's really changed, I think, the dynamics of what we're doing between home and school. And yet the Catholic culture, as Jen was just mentioning, reinforces that from the beginning and from the get-go. And we want to build upon that. And that's something we really emphasize in the article about the nature of the Holy Family and the nature of the teachings of the Church to include all individuals, including, of course, those with disabilities. And, of course, the parish, as Jen was mentioning, reinforces it. The inclusion, of course, we want all members of our parish to be access to and participate in the sacraments, but also things like CYO and the opportunities in our community to be a participant there. We do that very nicely right now with community involving all our children with CYO, regardless of whether or not they attend the Catholic school. In many of our parishes, my son was one like that. But also, of course, for other individuals, including those with disabilities. So with that, and what we want to do is beyond access, and we'll reinforce that. With that, we wanted to reinforce the fact that many of us, and Greg was alluding to this, I think many of us at times start thinking special education, especially if we're getting started in this idea of inclusion. We tend to think over to the public schools. And as Greg was mentioning, that old segregated model where we'll pull the individual out and send them to the resource room. Well, that means we need to have a special education teacher. We need to have a series of paraprofessionals. We need to have all these related service providers. And we need to have this whole infrastructure. And we're not saying there's not value in that, but Catholic school is a little different. And we know that. And there's already a culture of collaboration. There's already a culture of the power of 2 or 3 or 4. And that's the inclusion aspect that we want to build upon. So that child with a disability is in our general education classroom. Yes, there might be supports. Yes, there might be supports in what we call an aide, or maybe a parent aide comes in, or maybe there's a paraprofessional. And of course, many of us are interacting with our public schools for related services. So yes, of course, it can still get those related services. But for us to inclusion to work, it's not to create a whole special education service structure. Public schools have done that. And I think Greg, Jen, and I would say that there's been some failure in that segregated model. So, all right. So with that said, what we wanted to reinforce for a portion of this presentation is what's been taking place since the pandemic. And that is, I think we've all recognized the variability of the learners we're serving. And when we say that, we want to emphasize the fact, as Greg mentioned, of course, students with disabilities, and the poster children of inclusion for kids in Catholic education, literally on several inclusive Catholic education websites, are kids with Down syndrome or kids with autism. And true, that's been an effort, and there's been a lot of national and local efforts there. I live in the Kansas City area, and FIRE has a critical organization that's been towards full inclusion in religious education. And of course, Down syndrome and children with autism has been the focus at times. But the variability, what we want to focus in on is the fact that, my goodness, the variability since the pandemic, I know we've all been opened our eyes to the executive functions, to the fact that students that are typically developing, oh my gosh, memory issues, distractions, attention, poor organization, the list goes on, the social emotional aspect and the anxiety. Jen, I think you've experienced it with your own children. You have school-age children in terms of the anxiety of being remote and that aspect, or be it face-to-face, but also some of those restrictions. And Greg also has school-age children. I have a school-age daughter, and that anxiety, that social-emotional is very, very relevant. So those types of things are happening with our typically developing individuals. And so we've had to plan and design differently. We've had to think about that variability in that child. To me, that's awesome in that it's making us aware. Now, it's not awesome that there's challenges in the children we're serving, but it's awesome that the variability exists, because for us to include students with disabilities, it allows for a lot of flexibility, allows for a lot of different planning and designing. Now, let me simply give this as an example. You see 2 shoes here. And I put our KU shoes here, guys, but I didn't put our University of Maryland one. I'm sorry, Jen. I put my Notre Dame one, though, okay? And so the idea here, folks, is let's go with this analogy. Welcome to the University of Kansas, or the University of Maryland, or the University of Notre Dame. You've all been accepted as scholarship athletes. Congratulations. Greg, what sport are you going to play as a scholarship athlete?
Definitely football.
Football. Jen, what sport are we going to play as a scholarship athlete?
I would have to say football.
Football as well. Okay. I'm going to go with tennis. I like tennis. Now, the beautiful thing about it is we have contracts with Adidas or Nikes, and so we're going to get head to toe garb. The only thing that they're not going to clothe us in is the fancy formal wear, okay? Otherwise, we're set. We can walk through campus any season of the year and be equipped with free stuff, including shoes. Now, this variability example I'm talking about has to do with the shoes because, see, we believe in this idea of average. We believe in this idea of typical. And so we're going to design and plan for that. And so we're all going to get shoes that are size 8 women's. Now, I'm not going to ask Jen her shoe size, okay? But if she's, let's say, a size 6.5, 7, 7.5, I think she's okay because she can always put on a couple pairs of socks. But if she's size 8.5, she's still all right. But size 9, and I know Greg and I, we're way beyond size 8. So sadly, after a semester on campus with those shoes, they're going to ask us to leave, or they'll say you can stay, but you got to pay because the typical the idea of planning for average, our shoes are above, our foot sizes are above average. So all of a sudden, we won't be able to perform appropriately. We won't be able to perform up to our abilities. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, to me, we do this regularly in our schools. And I think the pandemic has made us aware of some of the things that we do regularly and not thinking about the variability that exists in all learners. And what am I talking about here? Well, Todd Rose talks about this in respect to pilots. And I want to introduce this real quickly in a short little video. And I'm going to have him play and talk to us about this idea of pilots and the average aspect there and planning for variability.
With the cockpit age, Todd Rose. It's 1952, and the Air Force has a problem. They've got good pilots flying better planes, but they're getting worse results, and they don't know why. And for a while, they blame the pilots. They even blame the technology. And they eventually got around to blaming the flight instructors. But it turned out that the problem was actually with the cockpit. Let me explain. Imagine you're a fighter pilot. You're operating a machine that in some cases can travel faster than the speed of sound, and where issues between success and failure, sometimes life and death, can be measured in split seconds. If you're a fighter pilot, you know that your performance depends fundamentally on the fit between you and your cockpit. Because after all, what good is the best technology in the world if you can't reach the critical instruments when you need them the most? But this presents a challenge for the Air Force, because obviously pilots are not the same size. So the issue is, how do you design one cockpit that can fit the most individuals? For a long time, it was assumed that you could do this by designing for the average pilot. That almost seems intuitively right. If you design something that fit for the average size person, wouldn't it fit most people? It seems right, but it's actually wrong. And 60 years ago, an Air Force researcher, Gilbert Daniels, proved to the world just how wrong this really is and what it was costing us. Here's how he did it. He studied over 4,000 pilots, and he measured them on 10 dimensions of size. And he asked a very simple question. How many of these pilots are average on all 10 dimensions? The assumption was that most of them would be. Do you know how many really were? 0. Gilbert Daniels proved there was no such thing as an average pilot. Instead, what he found was that every single pilot had what we call a jagged size profile, right? It means no one's at the same on every dimension. And this makes sense. Just because you're the tallest person doesn't mean you're the heaviest. It doesn't mean you have the broadest shoulders or the longest torso. But this is tricky because if every pilot has a jagged size profile and you design a cockpit on average, you've literally designed it for nobody. So the Air Force realized they had a problem, and their response was bold. They banned the average, meaning that moving forward, they refused to buy fighter jets where the cockpit was designed for an average-sized pilot. And instead, they demanded that the companies who built these planes design them to the edges of dimensions of size, meaning that rather than design for, say, the average height, they wanted a cockpit that could accommodate as close to the shortest pilot and the tallest pilot as the technology would allow. Now, the companies that made these planes, as you could imagine, weren't happy, right? They argued and lobbied, and they said it's going to be impossible, or at least impossibly expensive, to build a flexible cockpit. But once they realized that the Air Force wasn't going to budge, suddenly it was possible. And it turned out it wasn't that expensive. And in fact, they made great strides, leveraging simple solutions that we all take for granted in our everyday lives, like adjustable seats. And as a result, the Air Force not only improved the performance of the pilots that they already had, but they dramatically expanded their talent pool. And today, we have the most diverse pool of fighter pilots ever. But here's the thing. Many of our top pilots would have never fit in a cockpit designed on average. So, most of us have never sat in the cockpit of a $150 million fighter jet, right? But we've all sat in the classroom. And I would argue...
Now, my focus here isn't on, or our focus here isn't on the picture here of the classroom with just the typical desks all in a line. But rather, one of the reasons that we wanted to share Todd Rowe's presentation is this idea that oftentimes we do kind of orientate and plan for this idea of a typical or an average. And that gets in the way of inclusion. That gets in the way of then having to add in accommodations and the list of things we'll need to do then for an individual with disability if we don't appreciate the fact that there's variability amongst all our students. And so with that in mind, there's a number of different ways to observe this variability, to observe the idea that there is no average. And of course, one thing, and if we had time, if we were face to face, we'd have you fill out a jagged profile. Now this visual here of this jagged profile is simply across 9 different types of elements of learning, everything from oral communication to creativity. And I would argue, having done this with hundreds, if not thousands, of educators and pre-service teacher educators, is the fact that while folks think that they're very similar, they're very different. And then you throw in the fact that you complete this in a normal setting, and then you complete it under a stressful. I didn't have my coffee. It's late at night and I'm an early morning person. I have a headache. Then how do you operate? Well, you'll find very quickly that group of 20, 25 students are very varied. And that's an element that we want to reinforce, because if we appreciate the variability, and we've been planning in this pandemic for some of this variability, that needs to be a continuation post-COVID, and that will make inclusion of students with disabilities and all individuals so much easier. So let me visualize this for just a minute, and then with time elements, we're going to have to move on. But just real briefly, and I'm going to move through these slides very quickly, but some examples of variability are the fact that everything from excels in music, some hearing impairments, limited background knowledge, reading challenges, etc., etc. Now, when I think of it, this to me is a great way to visualize what we're trying to do with this variability. See, in these 2 instances and these visuals, we have the fence. We have the players on one side, we have the fans on the other. The fence needs to be there to protect the individuals, but we have a variability of size. And so what do we do for the variability of size? Well, the tall person doesn't need to see over the fence. They can do it. They're fine. That average person and then that shorter person, they need a box or 2 boxes. Okay, so now we've accommodated them and now they can see over the fence. But if we take this into an educational setting, and this is often what we do, Greg, Jennifer, and I, we've had to create the boxes. We're the special educators. We do the additional work. Or the general education teacher's like, oh my gosh, I don't have time, but I'm having to create these additional supports to be able to everyone to see over the fence, which of course is what we want everyone to be able to do. Well, that becomes problematic. So to plan for that variability, to design for that variability, we use something called universal design for learning. And that focuses on, first of all, removing barriers. And in this instance, the barrier is the fence. Make it transparent, and now we don't need those boxes. I wish I could go into this in better detail. I will offer a few visuals. I'm going to skip over some slides here, but I will offer a few visuals, but then we're going to move on. So universal design for learning, folks, is a framework many of you have been exposed to. 3 primary principles. We're going to allow for the why of learning, provide lots of different options for learners in respect to engagement. The what of learning, lots of different options for representation of information, and the how of learning when they want to demonstrate what they know. Now, we didn't talk enough about this in our article. This, we believe, is a strategy to definitely plan and design for that variability, which hopefully pandemic has made us more aware of, even in our typically developing individuals, to then meet the needs of all learners. Now, another outcome of the pandemic has been the aspect of parents. And that's been a key component. Now, I know I'm flying through slides here. I apologize, folks. Time's just not going to allow for it. But instead, another element of the pandemic and planning for that variability is the engagement of the parent and that parent-teacher, teacher-parent partnership. And I know Jen is going to jump in here and kind of clarify what we already know about that and what we need to build upon that.
Yeah, so like you were mentioning, this pandemic has really illustrated to us where our partnerships with families needs to be strengthened as well. So in terms of partnerships with families, in special education law, it requires that teachers offer parents opportunity to participate in their child's education. And that is also best practices highlighted by CEC, the Council for Exceptional Children. One of the things about partnerships is it's built on mutual trust and respect that is tied to shared decision making. So it's important when educators and teachers are working together with a child with disability that they are coming to joint decisions about the intervention, the supports, and the outcomes for that child to ensure that they're receiving appropriate services. Sean, can you hit the next slide?
It's already done. Go ahead. Yep.
Sorry, I didn't realize that. Thank you. So also, when we're also thinking about partnerships, having strong, trustful, respectful, reciprocal partnerships with families leads to higher academic and behavioral achievement in students with disabilities. It also improves their attendance rate, and it also has a higher post-secondary aspirations for children. And also, again, I can't emphasize this enough, is that parent partnering with families is a right approach to decision making in terms of what is taking place with their supports and the interventions that are being taken place in the school. Also, we want to also briefly just talk about the important assumptions that teachers have about partnering with families. So teachers, not parents, have the greatest responsibility for successful partnerships. And then what I mean by that is that we cannot blame the parents for their lack of participation. We need to find ways to be supportive and encourage parents to be equal partners in making decisions when it comes to their child's educational learning outcomes. And we also need to find ways to have that dialogue with parents to see what are their needs, what are their concerns for their child, to make sure that we are also addressing those aspects as well. Greg, is there anything that you would like to add on this topic? Because I know this is another area that you are really familiar with as well.
Well, I think the only thing I'd add at this point is that we know that parent-professional partnerships are more challenging when we have families who are from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And it's not just challenging for educators, it's challenging for families, right? And oftentimes these families feel left out. They feel like they're much less a part of the process. I don't know that teachers are deliberately doing this. I think it's just we have certain sets of things that we do to support families. And sometimes, as Sean mentioned, sometimes the things that we're doing don't fit everyone. And in this case, they don't fit every family. So looking at strategies to support all families is important. And Jennifer mentioned respect and mutual understandings and things like this. And these take more time when we're partnering with families who are non-native English speakers, families from different cultures, families from cultures that are traditionally or an individual families from a lower education or salary background. It's going to take a little bit more, and it's going to take something different. So in that way, it relates to what Sean talked about with the equity versus equality. Do we treat all families equal and give them all the equal chance to be participants? Or do we think about equality and equity and say, what do these families need that might be different than the white English speaking families? And find ways to reach out to them and to ensure that all families can be a part of these educational decisions, and therefore reap the benefits that come from both the partnerships that Jennifer talked about, these wonderful long-term outcomes, but then also the benefits of simply ensuring that everyone in our community is being involved and ready to be supportive.
Well, I would like to also just tie this back to the figure that we were talking about. One of the main characteristics under the Catholic schools is to help parents to fulfill their role in their child's education. And that is really important in terms of partnerships. When we're talking about parent partnerships, is how are we helping these parents collaborate with teachers and closely listening to what the parents wants and needs are for their child. So that's also in terms of when we're talking about Catholic education, how we can address those issues of partnerships.
So the special issue, so we're having to wrap this up. But our focus in the special issue, and again, we hope you go and read the article because it gives so much more than what we've been able to very quickly share here within just 30 minutes. But the emphasis here, as Jennifer and Greg and I hopefully emphasize, is the fact that, first of all, of course, yes, we all want inclusion and levels of inclusion. We believe in it as a Catholic church, as a Catholic parish, as a Catholic school. But the challenge is, and to us, very, very briefly, 3 walkaways here. One is, if anything, the pandemic has reinforced the variability. And if we think of all learners, and we think the variability of our learners, and yes, some of our schools, we may look at it and go, there's not a lot of variability. And yet, I would argue there is, and hopefully Todd Rose reinforced it. In other instances, there's variability, as Greg mentioned, in terms of English language learners. It's right there, and the differences in our families, and the list goes on. So with that variability, how do we plan for it? Well, to me, we got to design and plan differently. And that's where the framework, which you just touched upon, is a great strategy to use. And then finally, if we're not doing it with parents, and if the pandemic hasn't reinforced the family's part of our educational experience, then we're going to have a very difficult time not only meeting the needs of all typically developing learners, but particularly those that bring in some additional struggles and those with disabilities. So with that said, feel free to take a look at that special issue. And again, I thank you, and I believe Greg and Jen thank you for your time. Feel free to reach out to us. And of course, this presentation is available on the NCEA's conference website. And hopefully the conference has been an awesome experience, and hopefully the rest of the conference is a great experience for you. So with that, we say goodbye. So maybe we wave a little goodbye, folks, and call it a day.
Thank you.
Thank you.